So in the last section, we put together our reusable button component. In this section, we're going to go ahead and make use of it inside of sign in. And then finish wiring up the text inputs for handling text. So at the very top, we'll go ahead and import our button. We'll say var button, and then we will require. So right now we're inside of sign in, so we need to go up to components and then into common, and then we could get button. So we'll go up into common, and then we'll get button. Okay, we'll go ahead and immediately add our button directly underneath the existing, the last text input we got in here. So we'll put our button like so. Now remember, there's two properties that our button expects. It wants a text property and it wants a on press property. So the text is pretty straightforward. We'll just do sign in. So this is the text that will be displayed whenever it's rendered on the screen. Now the on press, remember, will be a function that's called whenever the touchable highlight is tapped. So we will make a new callback called this.onPress. And we'll immediately define that callback in here as a function like so. Now we're not going to define what onPress does just yet, but we at least know what it should do, right? Like this is a button that says sign in. Presumably there's going to be some code in here that actually signs the user into our application. So we're not going to define that functionality just yet, so I'll just leave a comment to remind us that says log the user in. Okay, so let's save this and we'll refresh, and awesome, we got our button here. Looks good. We can probably tap it and we see that touchable highlight. Doesn't actually do anything yet because we don't have any code defined in here yet, but you know, we've got a reasonable expectation that it works, right? Okay, so speaking of logging the user in, that reminds me, the text inputs. So I can enter some text in here, like so, you know, my username and my password, but we're not actually like making use of that text yet, right? We're not like reading the text out. We don't really have any ability to say, hey, what's currently in the username input? You know, what's inside of there right now? What's inside of the password input? So we need some ability to read the text out of here. So you might remember discussing the concept of state a couple sections back. State is a way for us to record and react to events triggered by the user. Remember? Capturing input from here is another type of state. So when a user taps in here and types something, they are triggering some event. They are making a change to the state of our application. They're changing the state of this component right here. So we can use state to record and read the value of the text inside both of the inputs here. So as we go through this example here and the rest of this section, it might seem a little bit crazy, but bear with me for a little bit. We'll do a wrap up at the end, and we'll make sure that it's really nice and clear exactly how state ties in with these two text inputs. So I'm going to go ahead and delete everything in here for right now. So remember with state, the first thing that we do is we define an initial state. And we define that in the function getInitialState. Now this function right here is going to be called automatically by React to figure out, you know, hey, what's the initial state of this component? How does it like start out? What's the default? And when it does that, we need to return an object that describes our initial state. So we're going to say that we're going to have two pieces of state here. We're going to have a username and a password. And both of them are going to be a string, you know, the actual text that the user is typing in. So we will default our state to be an empty string for username and an empty string for password as well. Okay, so whenever the component first renders, our initial state is now going to be username, empty string, and password, empty string. Okay, so that part I think is, you know, not that bad, right? Pretty straightforward, nothing too crazy just yet. So let's think about what we want to do. Like, I mentioned a second ago that whenever the user is typing in here, they're modifying the state of our component. So it kind of follows that whenever the user types something in here, whenever they make a change, we want to update the state of our component. So what we'll do is we'll add a callback to text input where whenever something new is typed in, whenever a button is pressed, we want to update the state of our component with that new value of the input. So I'm going to add some new lines in here just so it gets nice and clear the changes we're about to make. And then we're going to kind of break up the text input tag here a little bit. And we'll say we're going to make use of a event property on text input called onChangeText. So if we pass a function to this property, it will be called every single time that a user changes the text in here. And the first argument to that function, the thing that's always called with, is the new text that's placed inside the input, the text that the user just entered. So we're going to make use of an arrow function here, and we'll say the first argument, text, and we'll say this set state username text. So in other words, whenever the user changes the text inside of this text input, update the state of our application for username to be equal to the new text inside of that input. Okay, so this part right here, I think this part is also pretty reasonable, right? Nothing too crazy in here. Whenever someone makes a change, just update the state of the component, right? Just say, okay, like there's some new value for the username. Let's record that on our component. Nothing too bad. So here's where it gets just a little bit strange. Bear with me for a minute. We're going to add another property on here called value. And the value on here is going to be equal to this .state.username. Okay, so here's the kind of the crazy part. What we're saying here, it's kind of I want you to think of this kind of as a loop, right? That's really what's happening. It's kind of like a recursive, or not really recursive, but it's like a loop. Whenever the component is first rendered, the value of the text input is set to this .state.username, and that initial state is empty string. So when our component is first rendered, the text input has a value of empty string. That means no text in here, completely empty. Now whenever the user changes the text, whenever they click in there and they start typing some keys, we're going to update the state with the key that they just pressed, right? We're going to add on that new character. We're going to say okay, they're typing something, here's the new text. So we're going to update our state for username to be equal to that new text. Sounds reasonable, right? So far we're pretty good. Now remember, whenever we set state on a component, it causes the component to re-render. So our render function is going to get called again. We're going to create a text input on the re-render, but the key here is that the value is now going to be equal to the new username, the one that the user just typed in, that change that they just made. So the new text input is rendered, and then it's put on the screen of the device. So that really the way to think about this is when the user types something into a field, they're not really changing the value of the text input. They're changing the value of our state value. They're changing the value of state. As a total side effect, as a total this just happens to occur, this is not like a direct cause, it just kind of magically happens. When they type something, it re-renders the component, and when it re-renders, it uses the updated value of state. So that's the key. The key here is that the user is changing state, and then when the component re-renders, we're re-rendering with the new value of the state. All right. So hopefully that makes at least some degree of sense. Try to think of it kind of as a loop, as opposed to something where they're actually just changing the value of text input. So let's go ahead and save this and refresh and go ahead and type stuff. So you're probably sitting there saying, okay, Stephen, like, yeah, all right, it works. I buy it. Like, we're setting the state here. But the password input has nothing to do with state right now, right? There's no reference to state in here, but I can still type. So, what the heck's the difference? Why am I doing it like this? Why don't I just, when the user types in here, why don't I use something that kind of looks like jQuery, something, I don't know, to read the value out of the input? Well, you can do that, right? That's totally an option. If that's how you want to treat your component, if that's how you want to design stuff, you can totally do that. The reason that we record the value on state is that it lets us do really easy things down the road. It lets us very easily say, set a default username. So maybe I want to say like default, right? And now since my text input always displays the value of this .state.username, I can now set a default username by just setting the initial state in here. Makes stuff like that really easy. It also means that later on, when we need to actually log the user in, I don't have to say something in here like, this .text input for username .current value, or something weird like that, right? I can just say this .state.username. It's totally straightforward. Anyone who reads your code in the future is going to be 100% aware of what's going on in here, as opposed to something like, this .text input for username .value, or something like that. So again, if you want to just have someone type text in here and then retroactively read the text off, that is an option, but I highly, highly recommend you go with this approach right here. This approach in React is referred to as a controlled input. So by controlled, it means the value of the input is set by state, not by whatever the user wants to type in. Okay, so enough of that long-winded explanation. Let's continue here with the text input for the password as well. It's going to look very similar to the one for the username. Let's go ahead and break up the tag a little bit. And we'll say the value on here, in this case, is going to be equal to the password. And on change text, the new text will be set on password as opposed to the username. There we go, nice and legible. Okay, cool, so this looks good here. Let's go ahead and save this. We've got empty string there at top, looks good. Let's refresh. So I can enter text here, and I can still enter text here. Looks good, I like it. So here's another nice little thing that we get as a benefit of setting our state or using our state to record the user's text. Let's say that whenever the user presses sign in, if, as a security precaution, if they try to sign in and they have like a bad password maybe, right? Let's say that we want to empty the password out. Like, we don't really want them to try to like reuse passwords or anything like that. Let's just toss the entire value in there. So what we can do is we can say this dot set state password is empty string. So let's save, refresh, and let's say bad username, bad password, and then I'll click sign in, and poof. When we clicked sign in, it ran the onPress function, which set the state of password back to empty string. Setting the state causes our component to re-render, and the value of our password text input is equal to the value of this .state.password, which is now empty string, and so the value of the text input in here, poof, just goes away. Goes to empty string right here. So again, lots of benefits to making sure that you set your state or your user inputs on state. All right, so lots of stuff on state. State is fantastic, very usable. Obviously, core feature of React. If it's still something that's unclear, do not sweat it. It's just one of those acquired skills that you just kind of got to cut your teeth on it a little bit, you know. Anyways, enough on state. Let's go ahead and continue into the next section.